and welcome to Navigating the 9 to 5. My name's Tess, and I'll be your host for today. Today, we are solving a common workplace problem, which is I've got a presentation coming up, and I'm really nervous about it. It's something that I used to get super nervous about, so I'm really excited to solve this problem for you today. And because this is another episode of Your Workplace Agony Aunt, which is our weekly email where we solve some of your common workplace problems. Side note, if you've got a problem at work at the moment, just follow the link in the show notes and you can submit your own problem. But I am thrilled to say that today we have an incredible guest in the form of the brilliant Andrew Simon, who is a communication expert. Hi, Andrew. Can you please tell us a little bit about yourself?
Good morning. Absolute pleasure to be here, and I'd love to. So, once upon a time, I won a World Public Speaking Championship for something called impromptu public speaking, where they'll give you a topic and you have 30 seconds to prepare, and they throw you to the wolves.
Oh my God, that is my
And
idea of it.
well, I was crazy enough to actually enjoy it, but I'd started in the field since I was about 12 years old or so. So it was a journey. But since then, it's been an absolute pleasure and a joy and a privilege to spend the last 25 years getting to help people with their presentations, with their keynotes, with high stakes moments, weddings, bar mitzvahs. It's been a blast. I've had such a great time working with amazing people, and it's something. It's so important, and yet I find it's something that so few of us were really formally taught.
Yes. Yes, I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. I think at school we were sort of encouraged to do like school plays and things, but that
Mhm.
sort of stopped at for me anyway in the UK, that stopped at about 12. And then if we wanted to do that kind of thing, obviously you could kind of volunteer for like drama clubs and all that sort of stuff. But if like me, you were shy and retiring, believe it or not, Andrew, you weren't forced to do it. So I remember really vividly kind of getting to sort of later on at school or like into university, and suddenly we were expected to do these presentations in front of so many people, and I absolutely coiled away as much as I possibly could. And I think what's really interesting in today's world is that I know people that started working during COVID, and obviously they've spent the first kind of few years of their working career, or maybe most of the last five of them, purely doing presentations and having conversations on Zoom, which is absolutely nowhere near as terrifying as kind of standing up in front of a group of people, or even if it's people that you know, or even a massive group of people, being like, oh shit, I've actually got to kind of stand up and say something. And I like be able to see the fact this was me anyway, be able to see the fact that like my hands were shaking and stuff like that. So I'm so pleased, I'm so excited to have you here. Before we get into the advice for people that are kind of facing this problem, I would love to know a little bit more about your story, Andrew. I'd love you to share that a bit more with people that are watching or listening, because it's an incredible story that you've got. So can you share a bit more about that, please?
For me, I'd say the journey really started quite young. So once upon a time, I won a World Public Speaking Championship for the impromptu public speaking, which was a lot of fun. But prior to that, what got me to that place, I when I was quite young, I'd already had about five heart surgeries by the time I was 12.
Wow.
And so, unfortunately, uh, I had to go for another heart surgery between 12 and 13. And up to that point, I was still able to be quite athletic. So I was competing in soccer and karate and all kinds of things. But after the heart surgery, of course, the family was a little bit nervous of playing football and getting tackled in the chest or punched in the chest in karate. So we pulled that back, but I was still a very competitive kid. And so looking for an outlet for that, I stumbled on public speaking. And our school was organizing speech competitions and debate competitions. And that was able to give me something where I could still be competitive, even if instead of fighting with my fists in karate, I was fighting with my words.
Love that.
So it was very different, but it was something I found that I enjoyed immensely. So it worked out. I'd say by the time I was 16, I'd probably already given about 200 speeches on
Wow.
stage at various moments, 200 presentations, give or take. I'd say I won my first international competition at 14, and
Wow.
then the world championship for impromptu public speaking, that was when I was 18. So it was a bit of a trial by fire. And then, yeah, just since then, it's been almost 25 years now of just getting to work with amazing people and helping them along their journeys in different ways. And it's been an absolute privilege.
Amazing. I love that. I love that you sort of rechanneled that energy into kind of finding your next thing, which by the sounds of it was public speaking, and in the debating team that you mentioned. Um, what about those of us like me? I'm thinking of Tess when she was a lot younger. What about those of us that rather than actively seeking out these things, we would actively shy away from the spotlight? What would your advice be to people like that? Because it's not just I've got a presentation that I need to prepare for. It's kind of it almost goes against every fiber in your body, doesn't it? To kind of put yourself out there and be like, I'll talk, I'll go for it. What would your advice be to people like that?
So I think that some of the most immediately actionable advice, I'd break it down into two areas, and they both involve reframing. So I think for the first part, we really need to reframe the way we think about public speaking because it's a little bit alien when you think about it. If I was to look at you and say, okay, Tess, start laughing, it'd be a bit full on. It would be a little weird. If I tell you a joke and it's funny, okay, we have something. But the idea that you could just laugh without hearing something funny, we can put two and two together and say that doesn't make sense. And yet, somehow, when it comes to public speaking, there's this idea where I'm supposed to be able to say, Tess, be a confident speaker without giving you a foundation to have that
Yeah.
confidence. And for most of us, to be honest, even for me, like I said, I was kind of thrown into the deep end of the pool where I was just started competing. But for almost all of us, we generally don't find ourselves being trained in public speaking in school. You were saying, yeah, you can have a drama club. For a lot of us, maybe you had to read your school report in front of the class, but
Oh
reading an
God.
essay out loud still isn't public speaking.
Mm,
Like it's a very particular specific skill set. How do you grab somebody's attention? What are different rhetorical tricks that you can use to be more engaging? What are
yeah.
actual specific steps that you can take to make a story more compelling? We don't learn any of those things. And yet somehow we're just expected intuitively to be able to go on stage and have the confidence as if we were.
Wow.
And I think that's again, it's just a little backwards because if somebody beside me was needing emergency cardiac care, nobody would tell me to just be confident and try and perform surgery. It's a bit mental. So,
That's such a good point. I love that. I love
you
that.
know, so I think as a first step to just allow ourselves to be able to not take any kind of blame or feel lesser than for having that anxiety or that uncertainty. It's normal. It just means that there's opportunities to grow and learn and build that confidence through building competence.
Nice.
And it's not something that you have to be born with. It's a skill like absolutely anything else. And I think the other half of that reframing when you're particularly anxious about a presentation is to realize if you're anxious about how you'll be perceived, in some respects, you're kind of starting with the wrong first principles. Where, in my mind, when I'm getting a presentation ready, the first question is really, it has to be focused almost exclusively on what is the value that I'm creating for the people listening. why is it important? Why do these people need this message? And then coming back from that, what can I do to make this message as clear and compelling as possible to give them the value they need, the resources they need, the clarity they need to be able to take positive action? And again, from there, you can walk it back to try to imagine, okay, now potentially, what would be the barriers in their understanding? What might be their biases, their uncertainties, and how can I then take another step and address those? And you find as you go further and further back in that process, very quickly, oftentimes the speech, the presentation almost writes itself.
Yeah.
And the more you do it, the less you're focusing on me, me, me.
Hmm.
What if I feel anxious? What are people going to say about me? And you're focusing much more on the problem that you're solving. And that, to a large extent, kind of takes you out of the equation in a way that I think can be very freeing.
I love that. I think those two bits of advice are absolutely and um so like I said, my public speaking journey was an interesting one because it was very much like I got into the working world and I was sort of thrown into the deep end and expected to present at all these things, and I was like, and I was really bad at it, and I felt like that was my fault, but that was because I didn't have the confidence to be able to stand up to my manager or boss or whatever at the time and be like, actually, I've never had any training in this. Please, can you help me before you throw me in at the deep end? So, but having been thrown in at the deep end, they then were like, yeah, you need some training. And I don't know what it was. I don't know if they phrased it in such a way that made me feel like, oh my God, I'm obviously so bad at this that I need loads of training and I'm never going to be good enough. Or if it was just me internalizing their feedback, or if it was just my naivety and not really knowing exactly what you've just said, which is if you've never had any training in public speaking, you can't possibly expect to be any good at it. And it's such a simple thing. Those two pieces of advice are just so useful and something that I have actually never heard before. The first one being give yourself grace. It's totally normal to feel
Hmm.
like this. If you've never had any training, how can you possibly expect to be any good at it? And the second piece is just it's just a really nice kind of it's not about you actually so much as the speaker. It's about the audience. It's about what they want to hear, about what they want to listen to. And I think another piece of actually really good advice that I was given is that the audience wants you to succeed. Like,
Hmm.
it is such a pleasure to watch someone giving like either a work presentation or a speech. And I think of like a best man speech. It is such a pleasure to watch when the people giving the speeches are really confident. They know what they're saying. They're just super comfortable. You can see them. They've got like one hand in one pocket, the other one's just sort of holding the microphone or whatever. And it's a real pleasure to watch. Um, my next question is like other bits of advice I was given. So there's this saying, isn't there? It's that to imagine the people in the audience as naked, and then they're like not so threatening. Is that good advice, or is that just going to
I
put you
don't think I don't think you're allowed to do that in 2025. I'm sure somebody would probably.
off? Fair, good point.
That sounds like an HR complaint just waiting to happen. But but again, I also I think the larger takeaway is to focus again in terms of when we're talking about the way that you look at the audience.
Mm.
It's not about looking at them naked, don't look at them naked. But it's more so, I'd say a few things that can be really helpful is to look at the audience in some respects in probably a very different way than some of us might be accustomed to. And I think for a lot of people, when you imagine public speaking, it's capital P, capital S. You imagine these grand presentations on stage and this theatricality, and you're speaking to your audience, and you have this outcome visualized. And the reality is, I think if you go back historically to what it meant to present, capital P, you can look at a time before we had the acoustics that we did and the microphones. And if you were to look at how plays were performed in Greece or in Elizabethan England, they were very over the top in their facial expressions, in their tonalities, because they had to play so big so that the person in the very, 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 very back who could barely hear what the person was saying could still basically get the gist of the presentation. And over time, you'd see as the way that we consume entertainment and media and presentations has changed, when you went to silent films, you still had that exaggeration because they couldn't use their voice. And then television, they slowly had to peel it back. And again and again and again, the devices have gotten smaller and smaller and closer to us until you had television where now you're performing in my living room,
Yeah.
and then you've got phones where now you're communicating a few inches away from my face. And the thing is, as we've had that transition, the idea of being that big, bombastic style of presenter and giving a presentation has started to clash more and more with the way that we've become accustomed to actually consuming presentations and thought leadership. Now, if you look at the most popular types of communicators digitally, they tend to be the sort of people that are having a very human, very intimate, very personal, not so much speech or presentation, but conversation with you. And it makes sense because if you had somebody flailing around like a madman and you're looking and they're 3 inches from your face, it would just feel too much. But because that over these last 10, 15 years, especially, has become what we've grown accustomed to
Yeah.
in the way that we learn, in the way that we absorb from thought leaders, there's more and more of a demand from audiences to have that same level of connection
Yeah.
with the people that are presenting on stage.
Yeah.
And so ultimately, what you end up having is that I would say rather than trying to present to your audience, it becomes much more about can you have a conversation with your audience? Can you look at a few people at a time in the audience and just connect with them and try to really reframe the way that you view that interaction to be much more conversational? And I think that you'll be much more successful.
I think that's a really good point actually. So you sort of touched on it there. It's sort of where and how you're presenting is just as important as who you're presenting to. So if if I came on here for those people watching and was like, "Welcome to the da da," and
Hmm.
sort of huge gestures with my arms as though I was talking to like 10,000 people or whatever, it's not appropriate. And actually,
No.
it's probably more than that. It's actually probably really off-putting to people watching and listening. And actually, this sort of medium calls for a much more intimate sort of I don't know what the word, not lesser, but like sort of subdued, I guess, kind of version of that. And I think that's a really interesting point around just kind of being human and
Hmm.
just being a normal person. And actually, the the best the best kind of way to do it is to just have a normal conversation and to just kind of be a human about that. And I think, yeah, it's really kind of easy to forget if you're on screen, if you're, bringing it back to kind of people in the workplace, if you're presenting on a Zoom call or whatever, then that calls for a very different approach than if you are kind of standing up in real life in front of a team of 10
Mm,
or a company.
I'd say to a point,
Oh, go on.
because
Yeah.
I'd say the other side of that is that because that's become the medium that we've consumed so much of, because this has become the new
Yeah.
normal, that now if you were to have those kind of really big, bombastic speakers, even if it is a keynote, even if it is a TED Talk, it can still feel a little bit jarring,
Yeah.
especially when you're speaking to a whole generation who has never really consumed media in anything other than this much more intimate setting. So in some respects, I find that it directly carries over, even when you are speaking in those big spaces, because so much of the world we live in today, we're dealing with artificial intelligence and
Yeah.
virtual reality. People are starved for authenticity.
Yeah.
And it doesn't necessarily mean you have to go in and be small or kind of bring yourself down or be subdued, but it does mean that if you're trying to imagine how should I perform, how shall I present, that
Mm.
it's probably going to lead you down a path, even if you're giving a TED talk or you're giving an AGM, where you're going to communicate in a way that doesn't feel authentic,
Yeah.
doesn't feel, it feels disingenuous, whether that's exaggerated gestures or using a tonality that's completely misaligned to how you really communicate. So if anything, I'd say if you're in a large space, you might want to ask, how would I be communicating this? If I was genuinely excited about something and I was telling my best friend, what would that sound like? What would that look like? And can I bring that person onto the stage?
Yeah. I love that. So this is really interesting because, again, harping back to to my kind of early working experience, um, there was very little around being authentically me. It wasn't about that at all. It was about the fact that when you're at work, you need to be the work version of Tess. You need to be professional, you need to be smart, you need to, look a certain way, be confident in this, that, and the other, and all that sort of stuff. So, my next question was going to be like, do you notice like sort of themes in terms of like mistakes that people make that kind of they get in their own way or they get in their own head about stuff? And actually, you've just mentioned a couple of really interesting ones there around authenticity and kind of alignment with who you are, because actually it's far easier to stand up as who you are and talk
Mm-hmm.
about something in the way that you would naturally talk about it, which is, like I said, is so interesting because in my early career there was none of that. In fact, that was actively disencouraged. Is that even a word? And it
We'll
was
go
very,
with it.
yeah, we'll go with it. It was very much like you need to kind of stand up and present this thing, and when you do that you need to make sure that you're wearing a certain type of outfit as well, because you don't want people to judge you on what you look like, you want people to judge you on what you're saying. There was a lot to take in, but anyway, yeah, so back to my question. um what are there kind of
I love
themes,
that.
like big mistakes and things that you see people making? And like you said, not being themselves, I think, is probably the first one, which is really interesting.
Yeah, I'd say that, and I think that it's interesting because sometimes it can create a bit of a push-pull dynamic. Because on one hand, you're telling somebody that they need to be conversational, they need to be authentic, they need to be real, but sometimes if you take that to the extreme, you tend to create a type of presentation that is very much me focused. Well, I'll just be me and I'll just say, what I want to and the style that I want, and it, it, it's it doesn't necessarily address the fact that at least half of public speaking is taking a step back and focusing less on what do I want to say and more on what does the audience need to hear
Yeah.
and how do they need to hear it. And at first, again, that can seem almost contradictory because, well, what if I just want to be myself? But one of the, I wouldn't even say challenges, one of the joys of developing as a speaker is being able to find a way to marry those two together. So being able to grow and learn, okay, in that first 30 seconds, how do I capture their attention? How do I really make this speech about them and give them something where there's a promise to the premise? They
Yeah.
have a reason to buy in.
Love that.
And I've piqued their curiosity. I've made them feel something. Again, we forget we're talking to other human beings. There's nothing more engaging than if you could make somebody feel a genuine emotional moment, whether it's curiosity, whether it's laughter, whether it's intrigue. Just building that up, and then once you have that, okay, how can I, in an authentic, in an organic way, communicate what I have to say as clearly, concisely, and compellingly as possible?
Love that. So you mentioned there um, something which I think is really, really important when you're giving a presentation, which is how to engage people in the first kind of 30 seconds. So,
Hmm.
is it good to start with a joke? Or these are a couple of things I've read. Is it good to start with a joke? Is it good to start with, they talk a lot about storytelling, don't they? Is it good to start? I feel like what you said just then is around kind of if you can get them to engage with you or to like feel, sorry, to feel an emotion while you're telling, while you've sort of started the presentation, then hopefully they're hooked kind of thing.
Hmm.
So it is, and it is a story a good way of doing that? And does it need to be an emotional one kind of thing, or you know?
Well, I'd say it can be. I wrote a book a few years ago on public speaking, and there's a whole section that's dedicated to openings. I think we have something like 16 or 17 different models for how you can open a speech.
Oh wow.
And storytelling covers a few of those in various forms. But obviously, there's others. You can have quotes, you can have different techniques. But regardless of how you do it, I'd say one note that is important is when you're looking at opening with a story is one, it needs to be able to be emotionally impactful to the audience and not just you. You know,
Mm,
oftentimes we fall into the trap where we think that because it happened to us, it must be interesting to everybody.
yeah.
And, a lot of times it's kind of not. And it's a hard truth that, when you're going into the story about this hilarious thing that happened to you last week, and you're 1 minute in and 2 minutes in, everybody's falling asleep because they're not you, they weren't there, they don't care. And you see shades of that when you have opening stories where they're just too long and they're just kind of meandering. And
Yeah.
at some point you're wondering, like, where is this going? Even
Yeah.
if it's a good story. So to try to be reasonably concise and then immediately, especially the more bombastic the story, to be able to dovetail and create context where you're taking the emotion that you created with that story. Maybe there was a twist ending. Maybe there was something that was really shocking or surprising, and you're contextualizing. You're basically answering the question, why did I tell you that? What's the moral of the story?
Yeah.
And immediately using that to build a bridge to the key takeaway of your presentation. So
Yeah.
you're not just leaving them hanging.
Yeah. Love that. Contextualize. Why did I tell you that? It's so important. Um, is there, so you strike me, Andrew, as someone that's just naturally really good at this. And like you said, you were sort of interested in it from such a young age. Is there is there truth in that? Or some people are just naturally better at this, and does that mean that those of us that aren't are, pardon my French, a bit fucked? Or like, what can we do about that?
I'd say no. I mean, I would say, I came from a family where, my grandfather eventually became a theatrical playwright.
Wow.
So, there is, and from the time I was young, we were watching a lot of movies. I think we had like 5,000 VHS tapes when I was a kid.
Wow.
So every night was movie night. So, I'm sure some of that just by osmosis, you absorb a little bit of an element of the theatrical.
Yeah.
But I also think, especially if I look at the area that I went in for impromptu public speaking, I was absolutely rubbish on my feet. In a one-on-one conversation, God help me if I was trying, disaster. And what I found was that I needed to build frameworks and structures. They say in the US, there's a saying in the military that you don't rise to the occasion, you fall back on your training.
Yes, I have heard that. Yeah, yeah.
And for me, if you were to just give me a random topic, say, okay, give a speech about X, I would find, even now, if I didn't have a system that I could use to structure my thought process or to pull the aggregate pieces together and connect them into a presentation,
Yeah.
I would be drowning.
Yeah.
So, I think that whatever your particular issues are, you know, uh, another example, I have certain people that I've worked with in the past, and they'll say, okay, uh, everybody complains that I'm monotone. My voice just isn't particularly engaging. I basically have one key, but it's just who I am. It's just how I talk. And you just talk like that naturally without realizing that, well, okay, let's take a step back for a second and take something as simple as, um, I didn't say I liked her as a 6-word sentence. Now, go through that and stress once at a time each individual letter. I didn't say I liked her. Oh, okay, well, who did? I didn't say I liked her. Oh, sorry. I didn't say I liked her. We're 3 words in, and
Totally different
each of them
sentences.
have completely different connotations. And
Yeah.
that's something as simple as looking at words on a page and deciding what to stress and being able to learn and appreciate how much it changes the
Yeah.
subtext of your conversation. And every person I've met has the ability to look at each sentence they're writing and grab a felt marker or a pen and pick one word in that sentence and underline it. And immediately, all of a sudden, you're sounding more human because in real life, that's how you talk.
Yeah.
Or being able to italicize something when you're saying it a little softer when it really means. And all of a sudden, you're doing a handful of these particular techniques that are not difficult, that are not something that you have to be born knowing how to do. And immediately, you sound drastically more engaging.
Yeah.
And again, it's not because necessarily you've become a better performer, but in a way, it's just because you've artificially made yourself sound as compelling as you would if you were talking to a friend or having an intimate conversation that you were genuinely passionate about. You're almost reverse engineering being your best self.
Yes, I love that. So I think this is where or why I struggled, like I said at the beginning of my career, because I was so encouraged to not be myself. I was in the corporate world, and it was very much kind of, you had to, like I said, show up looking a certain way, acting a certain way, and just being really professional. Only make a joke if you know it's going to land, which of course you don't, and then it's just my next question was going to be around confidence. Like I think a huge part of it is confidence. And actually, I was thinking um, just before this around how I could have improved my confidence back
Hmm.
then in order to feel more confident, obviously, in order to feel better, kind of giving a presentation. And I think you've absolutely hit one of the probably the most important things there, which is you like have a conversation, be human, kind of thing,
Hmm.
but be you while doing it. Like I said, I was kind of encouraged to be anything other than me. And I think the third part, which we haven't actually really talked about, is practice, which I imagine is this is kind of a huge part of your advice, which
Hmm.
is just really simple. So coming back to today's problem, I've got to do a presentation in front of loads of people. If you've come from a world where you've only ever presented on Zoom, then you need to practice in the medium in which you're going to be presenting. If you've got a particular big presentation or pitch or public speaking engagement or whatever it may be, if you could
Hmm.
kind of get into that room, get into that space where you will be making the presentation,
Hmm.
then familiarize yourself with it. That's one less thing to worry about. So I think, yeah, they're kind of sort of a few things that would start to improve your confidence. What other advice would you, or kind of tools or tactics would you give to people to improve their confidence specifically when speaking?
Sure. Well, again, I tend to fall back on one of the first principles of, improving your confidence by improving your competence.
Yeah,
And
love that.
it's something where, in a way, it's wildly intuitive because
Yeah.
you think you don't brush your teeth confidently in the morning. You just brush your teeth. You kind of know how it's going to go. If you've been driving for 20 years, you don't drive your car confidently. You're
Yeah.
basically doing it on autopilot. And I think that as you become more comfortable with being able to break down the process of preparing the speech and having, again, a very clear understanding, why do certain things work? What sort of frameworks are ideal for what sort of situations? It puts less and less of the stress on you to have to reinvent the wheel,
Mm.
and you can then have more and more energy left over to be able to focus on making it more authentic and creative and evocative because you're not doing all of the heavy lifting yourself.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of it. But I also think, again, not to just exclusively fall back on that, that what I would look at is, again, at the very beginning, trying to really be brutally honest with yourself. And I think that it's a step that too many people either skip or they take too lightly, where they imagine their audience is basically a clone of themselves.
Yes.
And I've seen that create so many unnecessary challenges where I remember seeing presentations, and it broke my heart. It was for an NGO and it was a great cause. But the head presenter who was looking to speak to potential donors, the way they were communicating about the topic that they were fundraising for,
Mm.
they were full of passion and enthusiasm, but they weren't able to take a step back out of their own perspective or their own frame that they had applied
Mm.
to how they perceived the reality. And they weren't able to ask, you know, if I had never seen what I had seen on the ground, and this was just another piece of news that had just flashed by my social media, how can I recreate that level of outrage or drive to
Yeah.
somebody who doesn't have that? Instead of just assuming that you already recognize this issue as being as absolutely crucial as I do, or
Yeah.
that speaking to a technical audience, just assuming that as I'm describing all of these incredibly esoteric features and technical attributes, that you are going to be as blown away and excited as I am as an engineer.
Yeah.
And so really trying to, and it's one of the hardest parts of the whole process, because it does require a brutal honesty and almost extreme empathy
Yeah.
of how would I engage this for the first time?
Yeah.
How would I communicate this to somebody who is completely out of the loop? And again, like what would be the barriers that that person in that position, does that align with their priorities?
Yeah.
Does that push against any of their biases? And again, step by step, building around that and using that as your North Star
Mm.
to guide the rest of the process.
Yeah, I think that's really great advice. Just come back to the audience at all times, basically.
Hmm.
And I think as well, particularly in a work context, if you're doing a presentation to um, your team, people in your team, so people that know you, know your area, or you're doing a presentation to the CEO or the senior leadership team, that is a very different audience and a very different level of kind of detail is required, a very different level of understanding they will have of your area. So, like you were saying, it's great that you're excited about the thing that you're talking about. Ultimately, they probably aren't going to be, but the point is to bring it back to what they will be interested in, what they are not necessarily excited about, but kind of like you said, what's their priority. So if you're presenting to the CEO, what they say, it's like kind of the four R's, isn't it? So risk, reputation, revenue, and what's the word? Um, what's the word for uh, high staff turnover? Retention. That's the one.
Hmm.
Um, so if you're presenting to the CEO, they are the four things that are going to be on their mind. So if you're going to save the money, that's your big message to go for, kind of thing. If there's a reputational damage at bay, that's the kind of the slant that you need for that particular audience. And I think that's just a really good reminder to everybody to just bring it back to that.
Well, and I think in general, being very outcome focused
Mm,
is something that most speeches in the boardroom and out of the boardroom oftentimes could massively, massively uh, take to heart and see a positive return on.
yeah.
You know, it's something. The analogy that I give sometimes is that imagine you're at the bus station and somebody walks up to you and you just hear, "Hey, how's it going?" Your ick factor is going to be through the roof. You're just, I mean, unless you're talking to maybe George Clooney, and even then, it's going to be a little bit. Whereas if you have somebody who comes out, oh, sorry to bother you. I just needed to check. Has the number 72 passed already?
Yeah.
It's like, oh, yeah, yes, no, okay. That's a very low stress
Yeah.
interaction, engagement. And I think that we all know that intuitively. And yet we can know that intuitively. And we go on stage and we start talking about our small microcosmic role or interest. And we're going on and on. And the other people are feeling exactly the same way as you would at that bus station, where you're kind of saying, okay, where are we going with this? Is this going to be like another 30 minutes? Are we addressing it? It's incredibly uncomfortable for them.
Yeah.
Whereas just being very outcome oriented and whatever you do, initially to get their attention and to create the bridge, to create the context from there, to be declarative immediately in the outcome.
Mm,
And then once I know where you're going, I'm a lot more comfortable with getting there.
yeah. Love that. Love that. Um, Andrew, you mentioned a couple of times that you have systems and frameworks in place
Hmm.
to help you. Like you said, if somebody asks you to speak on a topic for 30 seconds, I mean, it's a lot of people's ideas of hell, especially if they're standing up on a stage in front of people. Can you tell us a little bit about your systems or just kind of maybe the first two steps or something, to help people that are kind of really panicking about this at the moment?
Sure. Well, I think the first principle is realizing that everything is a metaphor.
Yeah. Oh,
Everything's a metaphor. So if let's say you were to give as hypothetically, okay, Star Trek. So I may be a massive Star Trek nerd. Uh, I will neither confirm nor deny this allegation. I may know nothing about Star Trek. So, if we're taking the case of the latter, and all I know, okay, it's a show and it's about traveling in space, okay, it's presumably space and maybe they're trekking. How do I turn that into something that I can actually speak on? Well, you have to think, okay, what is space exploration and celebrating that potentially a metaphor for? Could that be, okay, how we can come together to reach out and accomplish great things? Or the importance of kind of reaching out beyond our limitations and beyond our expectations
yeah.
and metaphorically traveling to the stars, aiming for the moon. And
Yeah.
then from there, okay, when I can bring it to something that has a little bit more emotional resonance to people, whether or not they've heard of the show or not, then I can start to say, okay, step one, is there anything that I do know about Star Trek? Story and episode, and can I turn that into a metaphor that plays into some kind of a theme that is universally emotionally resonant, or that speaks to some kind of universal hope or fear that can be the cornerstone of what I'm speaking about? And if not, again, walking a step back and a step back to try and see what can I find 1 degree of separation, 2 degrees of separation that I can use to create stories and metaphors and themes that can connect to the topic, but at the same time also create a through line or an underlying narrative that speaks to a core message that it connects metaphorically to Star Trek, but really is focused on something that I know is a hope or a fear or a drive that everyone I'm speaking to
Yeah.
can relate to. Because
Yeah.
no one actually cares about listening to a 7-minute speech about a random subject, but they care about how you can make them feel,
Yeah. I
if
love
that makes
that.
sense. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So that works. And again, it's the same kind of principles, isn't it? Bring it back to the audience and, you know, find that kind of emotional, make them feel a certain way kind of thing at the beginning.
Hmm.
So what about for people, like I said, bringing it back to the problem that we're looking at today, which is, you know, I've got to present something at work. It's Yeah, I think it's a fair assumption to make that the person that's presenting knows their subject matter. They know what they're
Hmm.
talking about. What they might not know quite so well is the audience that they're presenting to, and they might not have spent much time, you know, kind of literally, oops, standing up in front of people presenting.
Spontaneity.
Yeah, my charger just fell out, but we're doing all right. um, they they might not have had much experience actually standing up in front of people and presenting that way.
Hmm.
So um, there's, like I said, there's going to be, again, bringing it back to me. It was a confidence thing. It was kind of, and it was also I thought people expected me to be really good at it, so I didn't want to ask for help, kind of thing, in any sort of training. So, what would your do you have like a system or framework where you could kind of share a couple of steps that would help that person so they know what they're talking about? They're just really, really nervous about how to structure it, who they're
Hmm.
presenting to, you know, all that kind of stuff, and like, you know, need a bit of a confidence boost to do it. What would your advice be for them for that person?
Sure, sure. So again, I'd say step one, being able to look at how can I take this raw data that I'm working with or that I'm trying to present, and knowing the outcomes that my audience is looking to have
Mm.
discussed. How can I create some kind of emotionally engaging, whether it's a story, whether it's playing with expectations, whether it's creating suspense. Again, there's lots of different ways to do that. But how can I do something that isn't just, hello, I'm here today to talk about X, and people are half asleep before you're 5 seconds into your presentation?
Yeah.
So, and again, there's a lot of ways to do that. I think we could probably have a whole session just focusing on how to open a presentation. But assuming we're at that point, and one other thing that I take to that, and it relates directly to the last topic that we were on, as far as with everything being a metaphor, is the more you can train your brain to think that everything is a metaphor and to try to find the moral of the story and everything and the metaphors that you could extrapolate, it also allows you to take stories in your own life, in your professional life, related to that work experience, and to try to see, can I take this story that happens to be hilarious or dramatic and almost steal that energy for my presentation by finding a way to look at it and finding a metaphor that allows it to connect to the main outcome or the main energy or tone or message that I'm trying to communicate. And the better you get at that, uh, to a large extent, the easier it makes everything else. Because now all of a sudden, you don't have to be funny. You just have to have told a funny story and have developed as a skill the ability to take that story and make it a metaphor for the transition that your company is going through. And all of a sudden, it's a very unexpected opening. People are saying, okay, where's she going with this? As long as it's not, too far out of the pale, or it doesn't go too long. And then immediately, there's that sigh of relief where you're transitioning from that to being able to communicate, to bridge, to create that context. And people are like, oh, that's where they're going. And then right away, you're hitting the nail on the head and you're explaining exactly how that correlates, exactly what the outcome is, exactly what you'll be speaking on, giving a clear roadmap of how you got there, and then proceeding. And something as simple as just taking those few steps, all of a sudden, your audience is 90% on board. And so all of that anxiety of, I don't like to do this and I feel awkward, and that the focus again goes further and further away from that and more on just constructing a speech that creates an outcome, not just being outcome focused as far as what you're talking about, but even that creates an outcome for you. where you
Yeah.
stop worrying about how the audience is going to react. And all of a sudden, there's a tipping point where you start almost getting excited because you have the tools to create particular types of reactions. And suddenly you almost feel like an artist where you're deciding, okay, am I going to try to make everybody laugh, or am I going to make them feel outraged because we had this newspaper who was telling us how terrible our ideas were for the quarter, and I'm going to get everybody riled up right before I announce that we've blown away all of our expectations. And it completely changes the way that you frame even the thought process around giving a speech. Just the last thing I'd say is taking a step back from all of that, because I think that a lot of what we've discussed has been very content oriented. And
Yeah.
I do want to touch on, as far as people who are very concerned or very nervous about even just the physical act of being in front of people. They're nervous about, my voice, I'm shaking, the way I move. I think all of that, to a very large extent, can be solved. I mean, it's most helpful with some kind of coaching or mentorship where you can have somebody who can notice certain things that you're doing and just give you positive, iterative feedback in a safe place with enough time before the presentation. But I'd also say, in a pinch, even something as simple as just recording yourself.
Yeah.
And I know for a lot of people, that's the seventh layer of hell, is having to watch
Yeah.
themselves on video. But to just to do it, and again, I think so many people underestimate.
Yeah.
They because they imagine that public speaking is this thing that you just have to be born with, or it's just this, and they almost they downplay their own power.
Yeah.
Where I find, if you see a video of yourself, it's pretty easy to be able to say, well, okay, that looks a little exaggerated.
Yeah.
That looks a little bombastic. Okay, I'm kind of leaning a little bit. And just having that time to be iterative, to be honest with yourself, and to do it in a way where you're not attaching any sense of judgment
Yeah.
to that process. You're not saying, oh my God, I'm terrible.
Yeah.
You're just dealing with individual moments and individual actions and ticks, and one by one, you're ironing them out. And again, worst comes to worst, oh my God, I ended up doing that thing with my face. Nobody's gonna know it. Nobody cares.
Yeah.
Like you were saying at the very beginning, people want you to succeed. People, and again, I think the biggest part of that is we forget that people aren't there for us, we're there for them.
Yeah.
As long as you are giving them the outcomes that they're looking for, the value that they're looking for. And if you can do that in a way that also emotionally engages them and makes them feel something, you could do so many other things wrong, and
Yeah.
you're already in the top 1%.
Love that. I think that's a really good practical tip, which I did when I was younger. I've done this with people since that I've kind of coached and mentored, which is recording yourself. It is
Mhm.
single-handedly one of the scariest, most horrible things for the first time ever that you will probably ever do. And there's no getting around that. You just got to do it. You just got to suck it up. But you can do it, and you can start small. And I remember one of the presentation courses that I did when I was younger was we kind of got into this room. It was right at the beginning of the session. We got in, and the guy, I don't even think everybody was there. And the guy holding the session was just like, tell me a bit about yourself, Tess, like, where are you from, kind of thing. And I was like, oh, blah, blah, I'm from here, and this, and this. And he was like, can you just stand up and tell me that? And I was like, what? And I literally just went bright red, and I was like, oh my God, everyone's going to look at me if I'm standing up. And he was like, everyone's already looking at you, Tess, because you're talking.
Mhm.
The only difference is that you'll be standing on your feet. And I was like, oh, okay. And it was like, and it's just taking like really small steps like that. So I was
Mhm.
talking about myself, like, I know that subject. I'm not going to have a mind blank kind of thing. Like, that's okay. But it was just kind of standing up. And then it was the kind of starting to do other stuff. And the biggest game changer is exactly what you said for me, which was recording myself. And I
Mhm.
highly recommend that to people. If actually, like, even if you're not um kind of about to do a big presentation, or you've got something to practice for, or whatever, it is such an important leadership skill. It's such an important skill in the workplace. It is really, awareness is the first place we start with to be able to make positive change, isn't it? So if you don't know how you come across because you've never seen it, then that's just a really, really good place to start. If you want to step into leadership, you need to be able to communicate and kind of get people on board with your ideas and kind of, inspire people and motivate them to kind of do a certain thing or believe in your vision kind of thing. So it is such an important thing. So even if you're not, gearing up for a presentation, I would highly, highly recommend that. Now, Andrew, I've been making some notes while we've been talking, and this advice is so useful. Thank you so much. So I'm just going to kind of read out, I've got sort of 5 or 6 steps that if you are kind of if you're listening, watching, and you're about to do a presentation, you don't know where to start, and you're really nervous about it, then these are kind of the sort of key takeaways. Firstly, it's about the audience kind of thing. It's not so much about you, sort of think about the audience, and then think about the outcome. And that's the outcome that they want. So what the audience want to hear, kind of bringing it back to them. But it's also about like what you need, like what you need to deliver, like the one key message that you want people to take away. The third thing was about emotionally engaging people in the introduction. So either find a metaphor or, something that you can talk about that you can bring back to them that's relevant. The fourth thing, which we talked about right at the beginning, is be authentically you. So I was kind of, we talked about sort of starting with a joke and stuff. If that's not you, don't do that. Don't try and make a joke and have it fall flat on your face if that's not you, because all it's going to do is really put you off your stride. And then I thought about a couple of other things as well that I'd add to this. The fifth one, absolutely, is practice. Like we both said, we just talked about. There is no better way in my mind to get better than to practice. And like we said, you can start really small. You can start just talking to a friend, and you can kind of, within your team, for example, you can invite sort of 3 of your trusted teammates in, and present something to them. But ask them for feedback. You don't want them to be your friend in this. You want them to give you objective feedback. And then the 6th thing, which we haven't actually really talked about, is kind of along the lines of how I teach essentially as well, which is around feeling good. So if you're going to stand up in front of people and do a presentation, you want to make sure that you feel good, and that's from the inside as well as the outside. So you might be really nervous about it, but as much as you can, try and get a good night's sleep. Try and eat a healthy, nourishing meal that's not going to give you sugar highs and lows and have you feeling like shit, when you're trying to present something. You know the drill, all the good stuff. And then the last piece was around, thinking about what you wear. So for me, like I said, back in the day, we were very much kind of told that there wasn't quite a uniform, but there sort of was, kind of thing, like a corporate sort of world. And it's thinking about kind of being authentically you, but also wearing something just which makes you feel confident. So for me, and this probably is actually my corporate training, but it is usually like a blazer. If I'm properly standing up in front of people, and I want to feel like I look good, kind of thing, and because that will make me deliver it more confidently, sort of thing. So I think that's really important as well. We haven't actually talked so much about kind of feeling good and what to wear and all that sort of thing. And like I said, is there any more that you would add to that, Andrew? For me, it's just about kind of feeling comfortable and confident, I guess.
No, I think you hit the nail on the head. I definitely wouldn't ascribe anything in particular, since of
Yeah.
course, just across companies, across countries, across cultures, there's so
Yes.
much variation.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, you do want something that again, looks, if there is an expectation that might be required for you to be able to break through to your audience, obviously
Yeah.
that has to factor into the equation. But at the end of the day, exactly to your point, something that gives you that confidence, that
Yeah.
allows you to feel like your authentic self. Because at the end of the day, 90% of the work that we would be doing is being able to basically tap into the best version of your authentic self
Yeah.
and bring that person onto the stage.
Love that. Love that. Bring that person to stage. Love that. Andrew, I could talk to you about this for hours. It's been so, so helpful. Thank you so much. We've covered quite a lot of ground, but is there anything that we haven't talked about that you think that you would like to share or you think is important to anybody watching or listening?
I'd say that there's so much more to cover.
Yeah.
I'd love, I'm an absolute word nerd, so being able to find ways to create sentences that really stick in people's minds and that get quoted and tweeted and all those sorts of. I'd love to get into the weeds with all of those sorts of things and very particular technique. But so I'd say if anyone wanted to go deeper, I did spend the better part of about a year and a half preparing my book that goes
Wow.
really, really deep in the weeds with every aspect of preparing your material, how to organize, all those sorts of frameworks that we were dealing with that look at different ways to use words to make what you say more impactful, more memorable. And then a final section that's just dedicated to optimizing your delivery. So that's your voice, that's your body language, that's how you move on stage. Like I say, I wanted to have something that could be kind of the 10-hour conversation that nobody has the time for, but just encapsulating it into one place. And so I'd say if anybody wants to go really deep, I'd maybe recommend that's one option. And then, of course, I mean, obviously, following your program, every week you cover so much useful material on different aspects of communication and confidence. I tell everybody if they're not already subscribed, they need to be.
Well, thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Tell us if you, I don't think you have already. What is the name of the book? It sounds fantastic.
Sure, it's the art and science of public speaking.
Oh, I love that. The art and science of public speaking. Brill. I will put links to all of this in the show notes. Where is the best place for people to find you, Andrew?
Nice and easy, just speakwithsimon.com.
Perfect. Perfect. Brill. Well, all that is left to say is thank you to you guys at home. I always feel like such a TV presenter when I say that. Thanks for watching or listening wherever you are. If you can, please do like, follow, subscribe. That would really help me out. But yes, and last up to say is thank you so much to you, Andrew, sorry, for being
It has been an absolute pleasure. I've loved my time here. This has been great. You're amazing.
Oh, thank you so much. Back at you. Thanks so much then. Take care. Bye.
Take care. Cheers. Bye bye.